He is a director and producer of documentary films whose name before the titles guarantees a huge audience will tune in. His style of using original prints and photographs has become commonplace among other filmmakers, and the process has even taken on his name. Among his most notable films are The Civil War, Baseball, Jazz, and The War, some of the highest rated programs ever to air on PBS. Hello, I'm Ernie Manouse. Coming up on Interviews, our conversation with multiple Emmy Award-winning documentarian Ken Burns. History as we know it today, is it factual or is it just the stories by the people who won?
It's a complicated answer. It is, of course, usually in history, in the case of wars and conflicts, the people who win. But if you think about the American Civil War, the history was written by the losers. Our popular understanding of the Civil War came from the literature of the South in a very serious way, and also the popular culture of the South. The Birth of a Nation and Gone with the Wind, which were Southern points of view on the Civil War, have been the generally accepted view. History is usually based on fact. It depends on whose history. An academic history might approach it from a Marxist economic determinist point of view, or deconstruction or semiotics. Somebody like myself, our history is just telling stories. We think that the word history is mostly made up of the word story, and it's stories, for, at least as far as I'm concerned, that are based in fact. You know, it's June 6th, 1944 is D-Day. You want to make sure you get that right. How much there was
perspective then mixed into all of this?
Perspective is huge. The passage of time permits a kind of triangulation that allows you to fix that event a little bit more clearer than if you had done it the day after. That's journalism, the province of the immediate past. You know, Philip Graham, who used to own the Washington Post, said, "Journalism is the first rough draft of history," which is a wonderful phrase, I guess, if you're a journalist, but then you think, no one ever turns in a rough draft, which is what journalism does every single day, turns in a rough draft, and it really takes the passage of time to get that perspective. Just think about Vietnam. If you waited 10 years after the fall of Saigon, when America was in a recession, when Japan was ascendant, when it seemed that the whole focus of the world had moved to the other side of the Pacific Rim, Vietnam would be this ball and chain that we'd carry around with us forever. If you waited 10 more years to 1995, when we were ascendant, Japan was stagnant, we were in the largest peacetime economic expansion, Vietnam would have its centrality, but it wouldn't be this symbolic defeat. 2005, after 9/11, the worries that Iraq had become another Vietnam. Who knows what will happen in 2015? So it's almost like a good money fund manager. You want to sort of average out the highs and the lows and get at a perspective that helps you understand what really went on. And at the same time, you're still subject. Remember, the past is gone. You're never going to get it back. History is the set of questions we in the present ask of the past. And so it's very much informed by where we are now, what we're scared of, what we're confident of, what we're hopeful of. All of those things go into making history.
So when you take all of that into consideration and you sit down to do one of your films, how much of that is going to change your perception of the stories that you're pulling from the past?
Well, that's the interesting thing, is it not? I mean, we tend to think of our past as fixed and our future as open, when in fact our future is fairly predictable. It's our past which is malleable. And that what we have is a whole set of opportunities and perspectives and modes of inquiry and just the fortuitousness of information. I did a film on the Second World War, and I decided to do it just following folks, most of whom came from just 4 towns in America. Now, what if I'd chosen 4 other towns? Or what if I decided to do 8 towns and not 4 towns? I mean, what would happen? All of a sudden, it'd still be the same Second World War. June 6, 1944 would still be D-Day, but you'd have a different sort of thing. And it's no less true. There's no objectivity here. The only objectivity that I know of is God's, and she's not talking. So my feeling is that what you're doing is a kind of conscious subjectivity. You have to
Right.
be aware of where you're coming from. Be aware of all of the arbitrariness of the information that's in front of you. Just as you listen to the testimony of a veteran, you have to first establish that, A, he was where he says he was, but after a while, you just have to look the guy in the eye and trust with your gut that this isn't a practice story, or like the fish that gets bigger and bigger the farther away from the lake you get, that it's embellished, and that you're really hearing the birth of express memory for the first time.
How do you then know what you're hearing? Is it just your gut instinct? Do you
No,
come across
no,
a lot
no,
of people?
You do a lot of trust and verifying. You know, this last film on the Second World War, we left a lot of people on the floor, that cutting room floor, that we felt had the stories were too practiced, or we couldn't verify something entirely, or we cut back on someone's story because we wanted to make sure. But at the same time, human communication is an act of faith.
Yeah.
Just as you drive down the highway and those two headlights coming at you, you're pretty well assured that they're not going to drive right into you. And that is the essence of civilization, is it not? This notion that certain things will run because we are all agreed to a certain set of rules. So I think you begin with a certain act of faith towards your fellow human, and at the same time, in that old Russian proverb that President Reagan liked to tout, which was trust but verify.
Yeah. When you, with all this that we're talking about too, and I'm not sure that you can give me a concrete answer to it, but more of an emotional answer to this question is, do you ever feel the pressure of, when you do the war, or the Civil War, or baseball, what you have done now will be looked at as the truth, the final word on it. How does that affect you?
Well, all you have to do is read a bad review or get a letter from somebody who tells you how it's not that to remind you of that subjectivity. There's always that sense when these broad popular things, that this will be it, the definitive stuff. People wrung their hands after the Civil War and said, oh my goodness, and there were so many battles left out and so many generals, and you didn't talk about my great-great-grandfather. How could this be the definitive work? And we never said it was definitive. And in fact, what the last 17 years since the Civil War was broadcast has shown us there have been hundreds of documentaries made, hundreds of more books that have been made.
But you're still seen at a certain level. The success, the viewership numbers alone put this somewhere that I think for you as a person, you have to be aware of that, and there's got to be some kind of...
Sure, but I don't think it goes into the realm of being definitive, like because we've done it, therefore no one else can do it. It may actually be an open door that invites more people into specific moments, and that's what we found, not just with Civil War, but with baseball, with Lewis and Clark, with jazz, with so many of the other films we've done. That's terrific, but there's not a sense, it's almost the satisfaction. This is where art diverges, it seems to me, from history. And even in history, which so much of good history has an artistic component into it, is that it's never the last word. You're always going to gain a little bit more perspective. There's always going to be that new information that's made available, the diaries that are discovered, the guy who finally decides to talk or come clean. Wouldn't you like to have known 15 years ago who Deep Throat is? Well, now we know who Deep Throat is. You know, so it changes what Watergate looks like, and all of that will continually go on, and that's the fun of it. For me, the satisfaction is not in the response, meaning, oh, we've just shut the door, the vault on the Second World War. It's that, boy, we did something, and it touched people. It had a kind of an emotional resonance. Yeah. And veterans are coming to us and saying, I've waited all my life for someone to show it the way it actually was. Widows have said, I felt him there while I watched your series. Sons have said, I finally understood who my father was. He drove me crazy, but now I get it. I saw what he went through, and his silence and his reticence was so amazing to me. A grandchild has another set of experiences. A community finds a way to honor the people that they did. This is the way we do it. It's almost like echo in a canyon. You set something off, and then you expect the reverberations to come back, and they all take on new characters. They're no longer your own.
After it's out there and you hear all of this and time passes, ever have the itch to go back and change something, add something?
You know, no. It's complicated because you look and you feel over the course of the 35 years that I've been making historical documentaries that I hope I've gotten better, and you say, well, I definitely was better here than there, so you look at that earlier one, but it is who you were at that moment, and because I have the great good fortune to work in public television where I don't have any excuses to make. I don't have some evil studio boss that wouldn't give me this or made me use this person or that. I just, if you don't like it, it's all my fault. That's the good news. I can look at it the way you would a photo album, you know, and there you are in the 70s with the wide collars and, you know, you don't tear that photograph. Or there you had the, you know, a gut there after the birth of your first child, you know. You don't throw that away. That's who you were. So these films become kind of mirrors in an intimate way of who I was. And it's interesting the way people will come up to me and say, you know, PBS just played your Brooklyn Bridge film. You know, came out in '81.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. I think that may be your best film. And, you know, I look at it and I go, boy, it still has heart and there's some crudeness and I wouldn't have faded out there, but I'd never think for a second, like with your own child, you wouldn't think for altering that. That's who they are. And so part of the joy of this is just seeing who you were, for better or for worse.
When you go back and look at the old works, the past works that you've done, can you see elements of yourself from that time period for your life there, where you were emotionally and what things became important in the storytelling?
Yeah, they are that kind of thing. It's so funny. Somebody will say, when did you make that film? And I know that date just like when I know the dates of my 3 daughters' births. You know, I mean, you know it. And so as I've watched the film, and I don't go back and look at them. I just don't have time to do that. I stumble upon them. You know, I'm with somebody, or somebody says, we'd like you to come and talk, and you're suddenly trapped and you're going to watch this film again. And you look at it, and there's that bit of distance, the dispassion you hope you bring, some objectivity to the subjectivity that made the film. And then you remember the associations, the friendships that you forged in it. And what's so great about the luxury we have, the time we have in making these films, is that you get to know people and intimately. You know, as we began World War II, we said, we sort of paid lip service in our proposals that we want you to know the people that we will have in this film like family members, people you could have had Thanksgiving with. I don't know how many times I said that over and over again. But you know what? It's true. We love these people. And when a few of them have passed away, as this generation is doing so rapidly, we've cried, you know, like they were our own grandfathers or great uncles or fathers even. And that's good. There's been a kind of intimate connection. So each of the films represents certain passages in my own life. And you can't really say this was this period or that period. It was sets of associations and knowledges and sometimes mistakes and you know, oh yeah, that was taking yourself too seriously. Or boy, wow, that was pretty good. You know, whatever it is, you can see all of those things.
Okay, take me back. True or false, in college you only took one history course?
Yeah, Russian history. My first year at Hampshire College. Hampshire College is in Amherst, Massachusetts. It had just started in the fall of '70. I came in the fall of '71. The best way to describe it is it's like a graduate school for undergraduates. That is to say, if you know what you want to do or you know how to look for what you want to do, it's the place for you. You sort of design your own curriculum. And, you know, the last time I took an American history course was in, you know, high school where they make you take it. And I was interested in Russian history. So I took one semester of a course in Russian history. But meanwhile, I was having my molecules rearranged. I wasn't going to become a feature filmmaker, but I was getting drawn to documentary. And when I had an opportunity for essentially the senior thesis project to do something on Old Sturbridge Village, a historical village in New England, I suddenly felt like all the bells and whistles had gone off. It's very funny. All the shots in that film are live cinematography of people who are in character, in costume, and working farms and churches and things like that. But the last shot was a pan across an old painting as it moved from an agrarian America to an industrial America. And I remember panning it. I remember shooting it and going, oh my goodness. And within a few years, that's what I did. I was trying to make those paintings and extension photographs and other graphic material come alive and stand in for that live cinematography that no longer needed to be recreated for me, that you could actually trust those old archives to help recreate a past that I thought was important for people to understand.
Does it strike you funny now that that pan over a picture and zoom in is now the Ken Burns effect?
The Ken Burns effect. You know, it's so funny. It speaks to our screwy world today, upside-down world where the technological tail is wagging the dog. I was approached just a few years ago by Apple, Steve Jobs, and said, I want to show you this thing. And it's a work in progress. We've now perfected it, and it allows people with their iMacs to pan and zoom through their photographs. And we've called it the Ken Burns effect. And so, you know, now people come up and I get introduced. The only person who has an effect named after him. I'm going, okay, but it doesn't really talk about what the initial impulse was.
Right.
That too often, we took an old photograph and we didn't really look at it. We held it up at arm's length, waiting for that moment when we'd have the opportunity to have the newsreel footage, motion pictures, the stuff that was true. Right. And yet I looked at it as an opportunity to go inside and not just look at that photograph and see a close-up, a medium shot, a wide shot, a zoom, a pan, a reveal, but to listen to it. Are the troops tramping? Are the cannons firing? Are the bats cracking? The crowds cheering? The saxophone going? You know, and that's what I've done. I've tried to listen to these photographs.
Why do you think you stumbled upon that? Why do you think it became something you recognized and so many didn't?
You know, we stand on the shoulder of giants, and I remember a film by the National Film Board of Canada called City of Gold, which talked about the Yukon gold rush, and at times they would take photographs in the landscape and you'd go inside of them. And I just remember I kind of took notice there. And another film I saw about Gertrude Stein by a woman named Perry Miller Adato, in which she had actors sometimes reading things. And I took notice of that, and I thought, don't make it actors. That's too dramatic, too histrionic. Just have it subtle. We don't have to have only the voice of God, which is what the third-person narration is called. What if you had a chorus of voices that would read off camera in a sort of a real day-to-day voice the emotions? You could hear how people wrote and felt, and that you would add a dimension to that oral thing. You would, by going into the photographs, add a dimension to that visual thing, and then, you know, you just practice and you try to get better at it. And that's what I think I've been trying to do for the last 35 years.
When did people's stories become the focus for you?
You know, I think almost from the beginning. My mom had cancer when I was young, and she died when I was 11. My dad was a cultural anthropologist, but he was also an amateur photographer. And I think all of those three things, the anthropology, the sort of getting into the heart of a culture, the photography, and then this horrible, horrible overlay of death and dying in the middle of a middle-class family. So that in some ways, what I do for a living is I wake the dead. And I'm trying to make Abraham Lincoln and Jackie Robinson and Louis Armstrong and others come alive for you and myself. And that behind that is a wish to wake up people no longer present in my own life that you wish to continue the conversation with. And in some way, this is what history permits you to do. It isn't some false palliative that makes you think that, you know, you're living in some la-la world. It is that possibility to revisit those conversations that have taken place in the past and to draw some lessons from them, to commune in the simplest and touchy-feely sense, to commune with past lives so that the past can really become what it truly is, the best teacher we have.
Can you make then a film about anything as long as you have the people?
Yeah, I think so. An 8-part series on vacuum cleaner, maybe. Some people would say that would suck, but...
Thank you for sparing me having to say it.
Yeah, you know, because you sit there with your pad and you look at that bowl of fruit in front of you and you draw it, and it sucks, you know? And then somebody else comes in, Picasso, Matisse, Cézanne, and suddenly you realize, same bowl of fruit. And it does something else. And I think it's always, in everything in life, how you do it. How do you conduct an interview? You know, what makes a good interview? Can you interview anybody? Yes. It just depends on who's asking the questions and how that person listens and what the sympathies are that develop between people in the course of that. And that's at the heart and the essence of everything. Everybody within the sound of our voice, cameramen in the studios, technicians, people listening to us, know that there is that moment when the ordinary becomes something more than the ordinary, and nothing's changed. Nothing's changed except some awareness, some sympathy for the other, some willingness to listen, some extraordinary kind of communication that elevates our so-called ordinary being into something more. And that's what we're looking for. We always talk about, we say that we want the whole to be greater than the sum of the parts. So here are the sum of the parts, here's the whole. Isn't that what we say? Mm-hmm. But we never ask ourselves, what is that more? That more thing that we want? And I think it's actually a wish for ourselves. That it is a way of saying that 2 + 2 = 4. But isn't it great when it equals 5, which it sometimes does, you know, where you get the combination of things, and you get yet another thing that's bigger than the combination of those things. And that's, you know, it's the United States, e pluribus unum. Are we 50 states? Yes. But are we more than that? You betcha. That's what I'm interested in.
So then when you're doing your next piece, are you trying to do better, to raise the bar, to do something different the next one, or are you trying to keep the quality that you've already established and just tell another story?
It's neither and both. You know, there's no outward sense, oh, I got to do better, I've got to hit 305 this year because I hit 300 last year. You know, any ball player would tell you, I'm just trying to see the ball, you know, which is a way of saying I just need to keep practicing. And that's what I want to do. Now, I do believe, as I look at the series of films, and, you know, Jazz I thought was better than this, and Jack Johnson was better than this, and The War was better than this, it really doesn't matter. It just is what happens. It's like a ball player has a slump, too. The slump can be as instructive as anything, you know. So I think that what you do is you go out, and because I work in public television, I can tell you that I can give it my very, very best. And I work with some wonderful people who don't get as much credit as they should, and a film goes out as a Ken Burns film, and it really deserves to be a Lynn Novick film, and a Sarah Botstein film, and a Jeff Ward film, and a Buddy Squires film, and a Paul Barnes film, all the people who work on it. But we're all, I can tell you, trying to do as best we can. It's not trying to beat the other thing, it's just in that moment, with this set of circumstances, with this subject, with the resources that we have, the time available, to do the very best we can. And that's, you know, I feel now, 30 years later, that I wouldn't point to any film and say, boy, we were really dogging it then.
Really?
You know, I just think that each film represents, at that point, the best that we could do. And I feel really proud about that. I mean, I feel that's where the source of pride, not that it made more money, or was better received, or that it was better than the last one, but just that it represented, at that moment, the best that we could give.
When you're in the middle of a project, and talking from my own experience, and you realize the energy is waning, that people aren't, how do you get it going? Because in your case, people might not realize it can take 3, 4, 5 years.
6.5, almost 7 for The War.
Yeah.
That's a really important moment. And I wear a lot of hats. You know, I'm sometimes involved in music, I'm sometimes involved in writing, cinematography, producing, directing. You know, I'm very hands-on in editing. I don't do the physical cutting, but I can be minutely there. But I think the thing that I do that's more important than any of those jobs is just what you've said. That I have this moment when you've got that assembly and it's terrible, you know? And if you came in and looked at it, you go, boy, he's lost it. And I just know what to do next. I know how to make it better. And I'm not always right. I may take something for a few steps in the wrong direction, but I know how to keep moving forward. It's like being lost in the woods, you know? You don't sit down and cry. You don't give up. You just keep moving. And if you suddenly say, uh-oh, I've been going around in circles, then you figure out a way how not to go around in circles. And that's what I've tried to do, is I look at it and I try to see it as if someone is ignorant but curious about this subject. And how do they receive the first image and the second image and the third image and all the sound? And if they fall out, if I fall out, being them, what's wrong? Where did that go wrong? And it's so interesting. There's an amazing alchemy that I never really get to talk about. Like, I've taken stuff out of a scene that's good because somewhere a half an hour later things began to bog down and all of my colleagues want to change that thing then. And I'm saying, no, that's actually, it's not spectacular, but it was actually this good thing here that was one note too many, that if you take it out. And I've had huge things. And Mark Twain, we had this beautiful scene, and every time I take it out, the whole thing would flow. But you'd want to put it back in because it was great. So you put it back in, and the thing would drag half an hour later. And it's knowing that sort of stuff. And I can't tell you there's any formula. I couldn't write a book on it and say, here's the manual. I just know that if you wanted to sit with us as we're editing, you'd see a few instances where that was possible. And that may be the most important hat I have, which may just be saying it's a hat of optimism.
Yeah.
That there's there is in this block of stone some piece of sculpture somewhere, and we're going to find it.
Are you a big documentary watcher on your own?
Not as much as I want to. You know, I live in a small village in New Hampshire, and I moved there nearly 30 years ago, and I think that I gave up and miss the society of my colleagues in favor of the solitude and the ability to really focus intently for months and months and months at a time. In course of television and travels, I do see a lot of films. I'm a huge admirer of lots of this. I don't think there's any one style. I love the works of Errol Morris and of Frederick Wiseman and all the different styles of documentary that are out there. I mean, it's sort of like music. I don't like people saying, well, I hate this branch of music.
Right.
Because there's always really, really, really good, when somebody says, I hate country music, you go, okay, so you've never heard of Hank Williams, There's always something to commend itself if it's done well.
How do you get motivated to start the next project?
Well, part of it is I have that freelancer's anxiety and mentality, which is I never finish something and then I begin another. I'm always working on the other while the other one's being done. And I think the key is that it's like parenting in a way. It's not like, oh, now I have to move my attention to the other kids. It's just you got a lot of kids. So to me, it's just I'm making the same film over and over again. And, I hate to use this word because it's so radioactive. But all of these films, they're about American history. They're about history. They're about this. They're about that. They're actually all about love because that's what we want to give to them. So I've made the same film over and over again. And there's no difference in a way. And, of course, there's every bit of difference, just like there's differences in those two kids that are standing in front of you, and this one needs this, and this one needs that, and that one, But if you bring to them that love, then every day you get up and it doesn't matter. I mean, I wake up, okay, am I speaking in Houston? Yes. Am I working on the national parks? Yes. Am I doing something about World War II? Yes. Is it now back to Civil War? Yes. Am I trying to raise money for these 6 films? Yes. All of that becomes the same act of breathing for me. And I mean, I first of all think I got the best job in the country. So how could it be, anything but rewarding in that sense?
Well, I'm going to fight you on that right now and say I have the best job in the country because I get to talk to people like you. Well, thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Ken Burns.
To order a DVD of this or any episode of Interviews, please visit HoustonPBS.org.
Next time on Interviews, our conversation with filmmaker Ken Burns.
I looked at it as an opportunity to go inside and not just look at that photograph and see a close-up, a medium shot, a wide shot, a zoom, a pan, a reveal, but to listen to it. Are the troops tramping? Are the cannons firing? Are the bats cracking? The crowds cheering? The saxophone going? And that's what I've done. I've tried to listen to these photographs.